The Economic Development and Small Business Subcommittee on Housing will come to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Chair Grant.
Present.
Representatives Devendorf. Present. Scott.
Present.
Andrews. Cernglew. Here. Aragona. Zorn. Fink.
Here.
Zeboyer.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 6 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you. Representative Cerniglu moves to adopt the minutes from the meeting on January 25th. Thank you. And the meeting minutes from January 25th are adopted. As we continue to learn about the housing landscape in Michigan and the actions that have gotten us to this point, as we look at what does a housing crisis mean for us today, we will continue to hear presentations that give us more information, people who are on the ground doing work addressing these issues. So today we will hear from the Michigan Poverty Law Program. MPLP is a statewide advocacy program that focuses on policy and systematic advocacy efforts on the behalf of families with low income and vulnerable populations. Their staff includes experts in each of the substantive areas handled by legal aid offices, including housing law. Today, I'd like to welcome Jim to give his presentation and to tell us more about the work that they do and what they're seeing when it comes to housing in Michigan.
Good morning, and thank you, Rep. Grant, for the invitation to join you and your colleagues today, and look forward to our time together. It's good to see you all, and you may recall that I was here last year, so there may be some overlap between what I talked about last year and this year, but I will have some new content and some new points of emphasis, as you can see from the title of my presentation and from Rep. Grant's introduction. I'm hoping to talk with you today about rental housing issues. Be happy to talk about home ownership issues as well, and then with a particular focus on the challenges that low-income families face in getting and keeping housing. So Rep. Grant talked to you a bit about the mission of the program I work for. So we're based in Ypsilanti, and we are a constellation of programs that include programs such as the Michigan Elder Justice Initiative and Michigan Legal Help, which, if you're not familiar with it, would really recommend it to you as a great resource for your constituents, that it provides self-help legal resources to Michigan residents on an array of issues. So if you haven't visited, michiganlegalhelp.org can be really useful. There's toolkits on it, and helps people with very limited resources in navigating what can be oftentimes a very challenging legal environment. So again, highly recommend that to you. So in some ways, it's probably not necessary for me to convince you of Michigan's housing crisis, and more specifically, its affordable housing crisis that especially afflicts its low-income families. But there's some really helpful resources and data out there that I think would convince anyone who isn't convinced of both the breadth and depth of the crisis we, and really almost every state, I think every state in the U.S. finds itself in. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition is a great organization in terms of the research it does and its compilation, of the research findings of other organizations, including the Census Bureau. So I think this so-called housing profile of Michigan is very informative, and I think in very stark terms, underscores the challenges that low-income families face in getting housing and keeping housing in Michigan, and the challenges that that scenario presents to policymakers like you about how to address this problem. So, and I think it goes without saying that this problem is most acute for the lowest income families, and I think this first slide demonstrates that in terms of the size of the shortfall, the housing unit scarcity that we're facing. So, this demonstrates that and this equals, I should say, the 28% of renter households who are in the extremely low income category. So that's the lowest income category. There are 3 low income categories: extremely low income, which is 30% and below of area median income; very low income, which is between 31 and 50% of area median income; and then the low income category, 51 to 80% of median income. So what the coalition's research shows is that we're lacking about 200,000 units, for that extremely low income population. So, which suggests affordable units, I should say, and as I think you probably know, that the measure of affordable housing is housing costs that consume 30% or less of a household's income. So for most low-income families, as this slide also shows, that's a very elusive goal or reality of obtaining affordable housing. So for that lowest income category, you can see the huge shortfall. It suggests that 110,000 families do have housing. I think that's significantly attributable to their participating in some of the federal housing subsidy programs. So most of those are HUD programs, but there's an assortment of others. Well, not that wide an assortment, but there's also some Department of Agriculture, rural housing. And then, most of those programs are affordable housing programs, so the rents are based on household income. Again, that 30% of, in the case of subsidized housing, it's 30% of adjusted household income. And then the largest low-income housing program in the state and in the U.S. is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. It's a common misunderstanding that this is an affordable housing program, and sometimes it is phrased in that way. It's not an affordable housing program, and it doesn't provide direct subsidy to an owner or to tenants. What it does is it provides tax credits to developers, and what almost invariably happens is that those developers then sell those tax credits to investors and use the proceeds of the sale of those tax credits to develop the housing, or it's one source of financing for the development of this housing. So, it's a good program in terms of having created a lot of units. I think the number in Michigan, it's around 85,000 units, so easily the largest program. For tenants, the downside is their rents are not based on income. They're based on 30% of a percentage, and it's usually 50 or 60% of area median income. So they have below market rents, but often those rents are quite distressingly, from the standpoint of a low-income housing advocate, very close to the market rate level. So again, a good program, but very rarely, unless it's combined with some other subsidy stream or financing, very rarely is it an affordable housing program. So really the second largest housing assistance program in Michigan, about 60,000 units covered, is the HUD Housing Choice Voucher Program, the Section 8 Voucher Program, the HCV program. So I offer that just to let you know that that's a very large program, and it's one of the few ways that residents in these low-income housing tax credit properties have affordable housing. If they combine the tax credit rent with their voucher, it can get to an affordable level. So MSHDA administers about half of those vouchers, of those 60,000 vouchers, and then the rest are administered by local housing commissions around the state. I think there are 110 housing commissions in that range. And oftentimes, without getting too deep into it, and I am going to move along, but even the voucher program is not an affordable housing program for tenants because the subsidy is capped. It's what's known as the payment standard, and usually that payment standard is below the average rent. In fact, it almost always is below the average rent in a community. So if a tenant, which is often, if not usually the case, can't find a unit with a lease rent that is at or below that payment standard level, the tenant can still rent that unit, but has to make up the difference between that lease rent rate and the payment standard that determines the subsidy. The subsidy is that payment standard amount minus 30% of the household's adjusted income. So I think it's probably now in a majority of cases that families that participate in the second largest low-income housing program in Michigan, the voucher program, don't have affordable housing, despite this being presented as an affordable housing program. So in many instances, it still is. But I think it just shows that even for some of these programs that were designed to be affordable housing programs, that they don't produce affordable housing for the tenants who participate in them. So another huge concern, if we're talking about tenants who don't have a housing subsidy, you can see on the far right this figure of almost 3/4 of extremely low-income families have a severe cost burden, and a severe cost burden means that they're paying 50% or more of their income towards their rent, and so often that's not a sustainable payment level. One change circumstance in their lives will make it or can make it very difficult for them to pay their rents. And you can see in the chart, and I know it's not the clearest, some of those numbers that I am reporting. So cost burden is if they're paying 30% or more of income toward their housing costs, and severe cost burden is 50% or more. So, we're seeing these numbers. They've been high for a long time, especially in that far left, that lowest income category, but seeing them creep up in the other low income categories, as well as that next category. So this defines middle income as 80 to here 130% of area median income, and those numbers are even creeping up now. So I think it really illustrates both the depth and the growth of the affordable housing challenges that we find ourselves in. So another really great source of data about housing is this Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard that it recently issued a state of the nation's rental housing report for 2024. It also has a lot of good visuals, and this was just one that caught my eye and I think is very revealing of the trends. And what you can see is, not surprisingly, and this is over a 10-year period, that rents are going up, and I mean, that's quite obvious. But I think that this demonstrates it in a pretty dramatic way, of the loss of what is, and this in it of itself doesn't demonstrate it, but there is other data that shows it. What Michigan is really, in other states, are increasingly losing is what's often referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing. So that's just private market housing, no subsidy involved, and there used to be more affordable housing opportunities in that housing inventory, in that category, but those are really diminishing. So it's extremely hard for low income and increasingly, more even moderate income families to find that naturally occurring, that private market affordable housing. And I think this slide does a good job of demonstrating that. I think it's a little surprising to me, even that far left category, the rental units with under $600 rents, that there's still 200,000 of those in Michigan. I'm a little dubious of that. It could be because some of the subsidized housing units are included in that category. I don't know. But you can see where rents of less than $800 used to be a high majority. I think it's about 70%. Now it's a minority of rents that are under that level. So I think the average rent in Michigan for a two-bedroom unit is now pushing $1,000. It's still under $1,000, and certainly In some higher cost areas, it's substantially above that level. And this is, I don't know if I may have showed this to you last year, that I think this is a really effective device for presenting the Affordable Housing Challenge. And this is from that organization whose slide I showed earlier. The National Low Income Housing Coalition uses this device called the housing wage. So, what it costs a family on an hourly basis to afford a 2-bedroom rental unit. So it's up to $21.65. And really, that's a little misleading, that is lower than really what the cost is, because as you can see, I think it says this is set at the HUD, what's known as fair market rent, the FMR, which is not an average rent. It is set at the 40th percentile of an area's rent. So really, if we were talking about what it would cost in terms of an hourly wage, for a family to afford a unit, that number is going to be probably closer to $25. And for some of those communities, you can see the most expensive areas, it's going to be pushing $30. And again, not to get too deep into housing policy, HUD has also devised this other fair market rent measure called small area fair market rent. So these fair market rents are based on either a metro area. So in the case of Metro Detroit, that includes the Tri-County area. So Wayne, Macomb, and Oakland. In other places, it can be multi-county. In some places, it's just county. But what these small area fair market rents do is determine the fair market rent on a zip code basis. So, we're seeing in some areas in Metro Detroit, Grand Rapids, where the housing wage for a 2-bedroom unit in some of those places would be pushing $35 an hour. So I think, to me at least, it really underscores this gap that we have between wages for low-income families and what it costs for them to secure housing. And sadly, that gap is growing. Last year, that statewide housing wage was $19.10. So, that's more than a 10% increase, which of course is very worrisome, that I think wages are going up, but not at that rate. So that's only intensifying or expanding that gap. And, evictions continue to be a challenge and a threat in Michigan. The eviction case filing rates here are still below, fortunately, what they were before the pandemic, but they are inching toward it, so pushing 90% now. And I think in thinking about those numbers, it's necessary to know that Michigan's eviction filing rate is at the higher end of the range among other states, and higher certainly compared to our neighboring states. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania all have lower eviction filing rates. So of course, evictions are catastrophic for families and cause a whole range of negative outcomes for them. So this problem, despite there having been, and I think what's probably contributing to what will be an increase in this, is that for a couple of years, we had a very generous emergency rental assistance program, the CERA program, but that money is dissipated. So it was a good couple of years for tenants and landlords, because we had $900 million in rental assistance to use, but that money's gone, and there is not a replacement for it. There's a few, we're talking, I think last year, maybe $7 or $8 million. So, it pales by comparison. So that's certainly having an impact, that program going away. So I think I've talked about this issue, and again, I don't think I need to persuade you that we have a real housing supply challenge in Michigan, and not just in the lower income realms, but especially there. And so this undersupply of housing, especially affordable housing for low-income families, is having some very dramatic, if not catastrophic, impacts. So we need to find ways to create more housing units, more supply, and especially at those lower income levels, which of course is tremendously challenging. It's expensive to do that. It's hard, especially with building costs what they are. It's hard to close those financing gaps, but it's something that I'm thinking you all agree that we need to continue to work at, both in terms of, I don't think there's any alternative to, and hope that the federal government will do more to government support for this challenge, as well as, and we've talked about it, of looking at other ways to accelerate and facilitate the development of housing. As I said, using this phrase of rethinking traditional housing policy. And not quite a supply issue, I know, but, and I touched on it talking about the disappearance of the SERA program, but the need for permanent funding for emergency rental assistance and Housing First programs. Yeah, and it was, just to mention, it was a little unfortunate that there was hope. There's a bill in Congress, I don't know what the name of it is, but a federal tax bill that's passed the House, and the hope was that it would include an additional allocation of these low-income housing tax credits to, again, facilitate development of new low-income housing, but that didn't make it into the version that passed. So for housing advocates, and I think others, that was really disappointing, because it was an opportunity to enlarge in that program that appears to have been lost. And in thinking about, just to add it, and I'm not going to touch on it, we can talk about it otherwise, of looking at the emergency rental assistance and Housing First programs, I'm not even touching on the increasing scale of our homelessness problem that in the most recent so-called point-in-time report by HUD, that the numbers, there was a significant increase across the country. I don't know if maybe there were some exceptions, but in homelessness numbers across the U.S., including in Michigan. So again, that's a troubling trend as well, and it's not surprising, I think, given those factors that I've already talked about. So, in terms of other potential policy responses, or, of looking at ways to reducing barriers for people getting housing, and here, as I've said, increasing opportunities, I've offered some, possibilities, source of income bills that have passed the Senate, and what, these bills do is to prohibit discrimination based on so-called source of income. Primarily, what they would do is make it more difficult, not impossible, for landlords to refuse to rent to tenants with those Section 8 vouchers, with those housing choice vouchers. So it doesn't mean they'd have to rent to any tenant. They could still apply their legitimate admissions criteria to those applicants with vouchers, but it couldn't be a sole basis for denying an application the fact that the applicant is using a housing choice voucher. Other ways to increase housing opportunities would be to adopt eviction record sealing, sometimes called expungement legislation, that would prevent or make it more difficult for a rental applicant's eviction record to be used to deny housing. And how we see this present itself often is that credit reports, and more specifically tenant screening reports, include all information about an applicant's eviction case history. So regardless of the outcome of the case, so the mere fact that someone has been named as a defendant in an eviction case is, kind of to use credit report parlance, a derogatory item on that applicant's report. So despite there having been no judgment entered against that family, just because they had an eviction case filed against them, which could have been dismissed, that is going to be a negative factor in consideration of their applications. And increasingly, landlords are using tenant screening agencies to do the screening of their applications, and these companies generally use algorithms, and so that spit out a recommendation to a landlord. There's different services. Landlords can subscribe to different features of these programs, but this is a pretty common one where the screening service will make a recommendation about whether or not to approve an application using these algorithms. And again, in these algorithms, that just this fact of having been named a defendant in an eviction case, regardless of outcome, is going to be a severely negative item in those algorithmic formulas. There's a bill, and I think there was a hearing on it last year in this committee, the Fair Chance. I won't talk about it in much detail, but that would limit landlords' considerations of an applicant's criminal history, certainly for people who are re-entering society, as it is for everyone. Housing is a necessity, but if they don't succeed in getting housing, that the data shows that they're more likely to engage in criminal activity again. So I think that to enact that bill would be a great step forward. And then more generally, management of the rental application process. We've been seeing some, and I hear reports regularly about some worrying trends in this space, including very high rental application fees, in the hundreds of dollars now. And what is really distressing, well, it's distressing in and of itself, but especially distressing when it is very low-income people who are looking for housing and decide that they have no alternative but to pay these rental applications, and they're paying them oftentimes to landlords who aren't going to approve their applications. They're not going to meet the landlord's admissions criteria, and often, in many instances, the landlord doesn't even have available units. So I think it would be great to make some strides in this area, perhaps some disclosure requirements about whether a landlord even has available units, what its admissions criteria is, so tenants know that up front, as well as to permit, as some other states have done, so-called reusable credit reports for applicants to reduce the cost of that process. And I think a need to put some cap on those application fees, because they are skyrocketing. It seem to have become a very attractive revenue center for landlords. I think this is, I guess, a fair amount of what I've offered is opinion. But it seems like, and not all landlords, I'm not suggesting that, but more and more are kind of playing from what I'll call the private equity playbook, which has as the sole basis for existence profit and profit extraction and squeeze. And I think that's, if we're looking at that in the context of our housing crisis, it's only intensifying that crisis. And here's a range of other, what I'll put, that these are, would be responses to the barriers to housing stability that tenants who have housing encounter. And again, kind of along the lines of these stratospheric application fees, we're seeing, what I'm calling gratuitous, what many people call junk fees, that these are fees that are assessed to tenants for which there is no benefit in return. Earlier this week, I heard from someone who is dealing with a tenant who had moved into a property who was assessed a $400 administrative fee at move-in. No benefit to the tenant, but if you want to move in, you're going to have to pay this fee. And so increasingly I hear reports about these fees and the whole range that we see in other consumer settings, whether it be ticket purchases, but a convenience fee. I haven't seen this in Michigan, but there's one that I've heard from many other states, a January fee. Why? Because it's January, so $100 for you. And so that, these are in addition to rent, often tucked into lease agreements that, unfortunately tenants sometimes don't read closely. So have heard many times from people working with tenants saying, that the tenant was making the monthly rent payment faithfully and then is surprised to hear from the landlord that you have these many $100s in arrearage because you haven't been paying these fees. So, and sometimes, and I know that this is not legally valid, but it happens a lot where landlords impose these fees outside of the lease. And so many tenants don't know that that is illegal and that kind of extra contractual measure is not valid under the law, but tenants don't know that and think, and often to avoid the threat of eviction, just end up paying those, or not being able to pay them and then having to face eviction. And sort of variations on that theme are forced place renters insurance, which oftentimes require renters to get an insurance policy or pay a fee to get insurance that only covers the landlord, that doesn't provide protection to the tenant at all as well. And this is especially from advocates working with seniors, seeing more and more e-payment, so online portal payment mandates, and then charges, for tenants using those portals. Some eviction process related issues, I mentioned the right to counsel bill, and I think the promise that offers that, there's data showing that in eviction cases that more than 80% of landlords have representation, less than 5% of tenants do, and that does contribute to outcomes that are usually adverse to tenants. Mentioned just some other issues that I don't need to go into. And I think that's it. I didn't want to take, and maybe I did take more time than I wanted to in this presentation, but wanted to leave time for conversation and can try my best to answer any questions or to offer additional input or ideas or insight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for this presentation. We do appreciate it and appreciate you providing some more updated information from last year. We do have a few questions, and I will lead off. We've referenced a lot where Michigan ranks in comparison to other states in different categories, and you may not have this information right now, but I'm wondering, when we see that Michigan is ranked number 28 in the per hour housing cost, what a family would need to make per hour, I also think about the fact that over the past few years, we have seen a decline in population. So if we're seeing a growth in the shortage of housing and how much it costs us per hour for housing, but a decline in population, what are we doing? What are some things that we're doing differently than other states who may have a higher population, they're growing, but their per hour cost is less than ours?
Yeah, I don't think there are too many of those. And I think, one factor that contributes to the situation that you mentioned is that household size in Michigan has been declining. So, although we're losing population, that I think the decrease in housing size may be even greater, and don't hold me to that. I think that that's the case. So that, offsets or compensates or explains, some of why it is, despite there being some population costs, that we still have this affordable unit scarcity. And I think there's some decline just in available housing units as well that contributes to it as well.
Thank you. And then a second question that I have is, other states, you mentioned, have streamlined rental application processes. I've also heard of other states having universal applications when it comes to rental process. Do you have any information on what that more streamlined application process may look like, and kind of who is managing that process?
Yeah, I am not deeply knowledgeable about it. We'll try to learn more about it, but I think in some ways it's kind of equivalent to like the Common App for colleges, that there's a uniform application that landlords can adopt. I don't know if there are mandates for use of what I'll call a Common App in any state, but yes, I think that that there would be some benefits to that uniformity of an application. I don't know in terms of streamlining the process as well. And so most of these rental most of this rental application legislation is newer, not all of it. So I think the results are early, but I think in a variety of states that at least the initial outcomes appear positive.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Representative Fink.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As usual, I have millions of questions, but I think I'll start with some that center on an area where there's some agreement between at least you and I think probably most people who have been paying attention to the conversations we had in this committee, and that's the basic shortage of housing units that we have in the state. And I guess what I kind of want to think about is when you say that the housing shortage impacts lower income Michiganians most severely, I don't see how it could be any other way. I mean, it's a good, once the supply of it becomes too limited for the demand for it, the price is going to go up, and the people with more money are going to more easily afford it, right? I mean, isn't that essentially what's going on? I mean, isn't that why it's more expensive? I mean, isn't that why it's more impactful and negatively impactful on a person with less money to have a housing shortage than a person with more money?
Yeah, it is. I don't dispute that at all, but the trend is in the wrong direction. I mean, so I mentioned this idea of naturally occurring affordable housing. There used to be a lot more of it for low-income families. So that the impact of the housing crisis, which has existed for a long time, was less acute or less harmful to them. So, but the trend is going in the opposite direction. And,
Yeah, I think that's exact. Go ahead. Yeah, I don't want to interrupt your.
no, that's all right.
Yeah. Well, just that's exactly where my mind went on it as well. I mean, of course, you're going to have less of this naturally occurring lower income housing as your housing stock ages year after year after year. So the governor's plan to build 75,000 new units in the next 4 or 5 construction seasons, whatever it is, 4, I guess. I mean, if you listen to the home builders or some other groups on the supply side of housing, they think that we're short more like 250,000 units over the last decade and a half. And I guess my point is just, if you actually were to get caught up, I mean, that would be the only way to recover that naturally occurring low-income housing. It would be to have sufficient units, because, what is an affordable property in, on South Washington Street in Ypsilanti, where I grew up and you work. It's a different, the price point there for the same building is different from if it was on Arlington Avenue in Ann Arbor, by factors of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. So until you actually have sufficient numbers of units for every family to get one, you're going to have a shortage. And if you have a shortage, it's going to be worse for people with less money, right?
Yeah, I agree. And from my standpoint, that's why there's a need for more government investment in these programs as well, because otherwise that gap isn't going to close, and certainly at least anytime soon, for decades at the soonest. So whether that's in terms of subsidizing the units themselves, or direct subsidy to a tenant, or kind of what's somewhat of a hybrid, I know it's not a pure hybrid, the voucher program, expanding the voucher program, that I think there needs to be that movement, as well as general increase of supply of housing.
Wouldn't the removal of the regulatory costs of building housing be an alternative to subsidizing more of it? In other words, if the national home builders estimate, as they do, that there are $90,000 spent on regulatory compliance before a shovel is in the ground to build a unit of housing, and that's their average across all types of housing, I believe. It's certainly all single family. I think it's all types of housing. I mean, if we could reduce that regulatory burden, wouldn't that be an alternative to instead just injecting additional dollars into the marketplace where we're already short units?
Yeah, I think it would be a partial alternative, and I think it's part of the answer. I don't think it would be a singular solution to the problem. And, you know, I'm not an economist, but from what I read and understand and what people who know better and understand these dynamics better than I do, you know, say is that that wouldn't be on its own enough, that there needs to be more infusion, whether it's from the government or, you know, whoever it is, some source to close this gap, that gap is too yawning to be closed just by dealing with regulatory measures. And I'm supportive of, you know, that I think it's a, hesitate to say both and, but proposition.
Okay, thank
Thanks,
you.
Madam
And
Chair.
I'm going to interject here, but thank you for that. We have another question from Representative Aragona.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, sir, for being here. I had a couple of questions just as clarification on
Sure.
one of your slides. It's the one, my slides aren't numbered, I'm sorry. It's the one labeled.
Well, probably because I didn't number them, so
Okay.
pardon me.
Sorry, okay. I didn't mean to call you out on that one.
It's all right.
The continuing eviction risk,
Yes,
can you run to that slide?
yeah, let me get there too.
So a couple of questions I have on, I'll just kind of throw them all at you. And,
Sure.
And if you kind of want to clarify. This is, what this slide is showing is the numbers year over year of evictions that have started in the courts, I believe, but,
Court filings.
right, but not necessarily the ones that have finished. Do you know what the delta is between those two numbers?
Well, I guess they all get disposed of by one, in one way or another. So, you know, it can be by dismissal, it can be by judgment. And I could have included this, and maybe it gets at your question a bit, at what is called, and this is a product. So this is not full statewide information. If you look at it, this is information that's reported to the so-called judicial data warehouse. So there's not a uniform database yet. I think the Supreme Court, SCA, are working in this direction, but covers about 85% of Michigan's population. You can see the courts that don't report their information to this data warehouse. And I don't know if it's getting at your question, Rep. Aragona, but there's another slide. So you can go to the SCAO website or the Michigan Supreme Court website and get this information that reports what's called the eviction rate. And so that is the percentage of cases in which an eviction order is issued, and that's the final step in the eviction process. Well, really, the final step is the enforcement or execution, you know, by a court officer, sheriff's deputy of that eviction order. But
But you're not showing the rate
I'm not showing
here,
that,
right?
but I'm telling you to fill it. So that's, I think, in terms of actual evictions. Well, I mean, it's a big picture because there are a lot of evictions that happen even before a case filing. So, you know, a landlord could say to a tenant, I'm going to evict you. I'm going to file an eviction case, or threaten to do that. And a lot of tenants move out thinking that there's no sense in going through the process, or don't even or not even understanding, you know, that they have rights to defend against an eviction case. So, you know, those are informal evictions. And there's the lockout cases where there's illegal so-called self-help evictions. But in terms of cases, and if I'm not responding to your question, let me know. I'm trying to. But in terms of those cases that are filed, that eviction rate, I think, is a helpful number to show the number of cases where the court is issuing an eviction order, that near final step in the process. And that's been creeping up a bit too. But before the pandemic, I think it was around 20%, which again, compared to other states, is high, and it's been ticking up into the teens and higher teens of late. Is that
So you're driving at my question. I guess what I believe what I'm looking at here is somebody has filed for
Yes.
an eviction, but
Yes.
that's not the actual eviction rate, correct? So
That's not the eviction rate.
Right.
So,
So
no,
if
so
you
of
have
these
a-
cases, what I'm trying to refer to, that eviction rate, which is just one measure. And I think the Supreme Court, SCAO, recognizes the need for better data on these issues.
Okay.
That some of it's a reporting issue from courts and some resistance, well, I shouldn't say resistance to doing it, but we don't have great data.
So my question is, like, on this slide, on any given year, what's the delta, what's the difference between the actual eviction rate and somebody who's filed. For instance, I rent, I'm in between jobs, and my landlord, I haven't paid for 2 months, he files an eviction. I find a program that can help me pay or, help me for a couple of months, or I go to I know, for instance, my personal church would be willing to help if somebody needed it. I find the money, I get back on my feet, I'm good. So they filed, but I was never evicted. Does that make sense? So
Absolutely.
there's a delta there. So what is that? Do you know what that delta is, or is there a normal set standard? Is it different year to year?
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to crunch. The data that's available is about case dispositions.
Got it.
So the number of cases of total cases filed, the number that have been dismissed, the number in which a judgment is entered, the number in which there is a consent judgment, the number which have been, and there's some overlap, but that are determined by a bench verdict or a jury verdict, and those are really low numbers,
Gotcha.
even lower than in
Okay.
most cases. So
Thank you. And then one more quick one, Madam Chair. I was just wondering about the courts that don't file. I see Centerline, Warren, and Northern Macomb. That's my area. So I'm looking at these numbers and going, oh, wait a minute. For some reason, my home is not involved in these numbers. So can you help me out? Like, why are they not involved?
yeah,
in these numbers?
I think it's just more our decentralized court system in some ways, that there's not that uniform reporting service, so courts aren't required to report to this data warehouse, and I think the Supreme Court's trying to move. It makes a lot of sense to me, that there be a uniform reporting system, but I think some of the local governments have that control and have made decisions for reasons really unknown to me that they prefer to report to other systems than to this system. So I think SCAO would have better insight into that issue than I do. Sorry.
More data for you, people like you and I, is better, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I get you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question by Representative Devendorf.
Thank you. Thank you for being here
Yeah,
and
my
for
pleasure.
all of your work on this. I appreciate your comprehensive approach to the housing crisis. I just wonder if you could give confirmation. I'm hearing in your presentation that you're acknowledging that we absolutely do need to build more housing, but also an acknowledgement that on the way to building more housing, we need to be increasing access to housing, keeping people in their homes, helping people to avoid unnecessary evictions, that we need to come at this from multiple sides, because the folks that are most impacted are struggling right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's what I was trying to do is, offer what I think are some of the steps in a comprehensive response. So to, reducing those barriers, the barriers of lack of supply, the barriers of lack of access, that many populations, and I didn't even include a number of other, populations. So persons with disabilities, survivors of domestic violence. The list is long of those specific, populations for whom accessing housing is apart even from the affordability issues, but who have particular challenges in accessing housing. And then that final category of people who are in housing or maybe about to be housing, the challenges to their remaining in that housing, to being stably housed.
Yeah, I find your numbers on eviction to be pretty startling, but also the lack of representation that people have. And I'm not going to pretend I don't have a right to counsel bill that I'm hoping that we can support at some point. But I wanted to address that we know that when somebody does have right to counsel, 80 to 90% of evictions don't happen, that we find a compromise. How can we specifically help domestic violence survivors to have support staying in shelter and avoiding eviction? What policies would you recommend for that?
Well, so at the federal level, there's a law called VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, that has some housing provisions that in effect prohibit discrimination against survivors of domestic violence. So I think it would be great for the state to adopt those VAWA standards, that they would be tremendously helpful to survivors of domestic violence in both staying in housing and in overcoming barriers to housing that they're oftentimes their eviction history. So oftentimes, they've been evicted because the abuser has taken total control of the household's assets, and so rent doesn't get paid. Oftentimes, the lease is in the survivor's name, and so the survivor then has what's sometimes referred to as that scarlet E of eviction. So, there are ways, and I think the federal VAWA housing provisions go a long way to doing that. So that wouldn't totally solve that challenge, but it would significantly diminish it.
Thank you. We have a question from Representative DeBoyer.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick ones. First one is, forgive me, I didn't write the number down, but you gave a number on how many millions of dollars we spent. I think it was from COVID relief dollars that went
Yeah.
towards housing.
Pushing $1 billion.
It was pushing $1 billion.
$900 million.
Isn't it true that in the period from about 2019 to present that we've seen the steepest increase in rent, as if you measure it as the same size segment over time? I mean, that's really what we're witnessing right now. Rent costs have.
Yeah, and they were going up, and they have. I mean, fortunately, they're plateauing a bit now.
Right.
So, but yes, I mean, for that 3-year period, and especially I think 20 to late 20 to
Right.
through 22.
So, I mean, I think there's a clear demonstration of the principle of the more dollars that come at a product that there's a shortage of, the more expensive the product's going to become, which is exactly what occurred in that period. Correct? I mean, that's really what occurred. We
yeah,
artificially injected money into a market that had a shortage.
Yeah, I
Right.
think that was one factor. I don't think that was pure causation, but
Okay.
we could talk. But I don't dispute.
It's debatable at least, right? So.
Well, no, I concede. I don't dispute that was a factor. Again, I don't think that was a sole factor.
Sure.
And there were so many other forces
Yeah.
at play as
Just
well.
a second really quick question on the possible rental housing policy responses. One of them is the eviction record ceiling expungement, right? And I spent 12 years in a courthouse. I understand exactly what that means. But you used a term and you said that indicator on an application or whatever term you might use, research to find out on a tenant, it comes back and it's deemed to be a severely negative item.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it a severely negative item?
Yep. I mean, don't ask. I think you'd have to ask those tenants. Sorry, I didn't mean to be flippant.
No,
Don't ask me, but because it's built into the algorithms that these tenant reporting services use. It's just how it is that they've determined that this is an indicator of likely tenant, I don't know if it'd be called poor performance or maybe not meeting the obligations of tenancy, despite the tenant, no judgment or no negative outcome, having been entered against the tenant.
Correct. But when you say that it would demonstrate a preponderance, perhaps, to not hold good on your side of a contract, potential.
Again, I think it would be modest, and I can't quantify. I'm not going to pretend to quantify.
Well, would we
what
be
that-
safe to say that it's a practice of landlords to file these without cause?
Well, it happens on occasion.
Occasion,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Like any civil action, right?
Yeah.
On occasion, they're frivolous and they're filed without merit.
But often for very low amounts.
Right.
Too. So, and I think that, if we're talking about less than a month's rent.
Sure.
That there is reason to think that in terms of housing policy, that it might not be good to impose that severe sanction of. not
Yeah, I mean, I
housing
think
as a
that
result.
reasonable people can say that there should be a window, right, of opportunity. But at the end of the day, the contract is a very simple contract. I'm going to provide you housing. You're going to pay me for that.
Right, well,
That's it.
housing that is in good repair.
Sure,
So
of
that
course.
there's often those issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that could be the case. I mean, that's a good example. A tenant might be withholding rent because the landlord hasn't made repairs, and which
Sure.
a tenant has a right to do, and a landlord then could file a case. And that case, would then appear on the tenant's
Mm-hmm.
report, despite, there maybe being a settlement where a landlord agrees to a substantial rent abatement. So, yeah. I
How do we
think that-
differentiate between those two, though? The one that legitimately was a non-payment just because it was a non-payment, and the one that was perhaps money held back? How do we differentiate between
Yeah, I
them,
think
right?
it's hard
And who's
to-
the arbitrator at the end of the day to find out, to make the determination whether a person should be
Right
rented to
now,
or
it's
not?
these tenant reporting agencies, and they just put it down. They don't look at, they don't delve too deep into the case history. That,
Gotcha.
you know, they look at case filing, I think, and judgment are the two primary indicators or case characteristics that they're
Yeah.
looking for.
Yeah. Would we argue, though, that it's not up to the landlord to determine who they rent to within the parameters of appropriate determination? You know, we know what all those other violations are. At the end, it's still the landlord's determination. Is that correct? Is that safe to believe that we agree with that or agree to that?
Yeah, I think I
Okay.
mostly do. I think with some reasonable constraints.
Yeah.
You know, on what they can,
Make
they
a
can
determination
properly,
on. Yeah.
Consider, but yes, and I don't think this would propose, you know, the bill would propose to do is to, you know, lift that opportunity, or if we call it privilege, right?
Right.
Of a landlord to evaluate rental applications. But, you know, what's happening more and more is the landlords aren't even doing that.
Gotcha.
It's these tenant report, they just, they subscribe.
Whatever
to
it is, right,
Services.
yeah, okay.
And pay and say, it's out of our hands and make a decision. Not all of them, but I think it's increasingly the case that they're using these services.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the information. Thank you,
Yes.
Chair.
Thank you. And then we have one final question, if we can keep it quick, and we will wrap up here from Representative Fink.
Of course, I have more than one, but I will be quick. No, actually, just to kind of pick up on that, do you know what, I mean, like, do you know what difference it makes if a landlord who has, say, a consent judgment that is satisfied, if they, as a matter of course, file a satisfaction of judgment with the court, which I think has become more common in the last decade or so? Do you know how much that helps a tenant whose credit history is being reviewed?
You know, don't hold me on this one, and I could ask people who know more, but I don't think it makes much difference.
I can just say,
I think that, you know, that what and they scrape. I mean, they scrape the data, and so they're just looking for these particular case characteristics. The mere filing.
Which I understand. I would represent that anecdotally. I can't display this at a level of any data, you know, you can collect. But anecdotally, as a landlord's attorney, we often would get requests from people who had had a case 2 or 3 years or 7 or 8 years before, and they would say, "I've got an application out. The landlord, you know, noticed I have this case. They said if you file a satisfaction of judgment, then it would make things better." And so we would do that, and it became a matter of course to file a satisfaction when we were filing the applications for orders of eviction on the cases that weren't satisfied, and we started filing the satisfactions. It avoided, you know, the landlord having, or the landlord's attorney later having to go back and do that for somebody who was asking for it. Of course, it's reasonable that they would. Just if I could just very quickly ask one other thing, which is you mentioned the Fair Chance Bill. That's House Bill 4878. My read of that bill is that if you were, for example, a single woman who had an upstairs apartment, and you had been physically assaulted by somebody in the past, if that person were to apply to rent your unit from you in the same building as you, you would be compelled to rent to that person. Do you have a different reading of that bill?
I'm going to interject just because I don't think we should ask for his interpretation of.
Well, he says it would be a helpful bill. I just want to know if he agrees that that's how the bill would work.
I understand, and I think that we can delve into that policy offline because that's a very specific one-off option in the policy.
Okay, so we know about
I do appreciate the lively conversation today, and Jim, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you coming and sharing some critical information with us. Representative Scott moves to excuse absent members. There being no objection, the motion prevails, and there being no more business before the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you.